So we covered quite a bit of stuff this semester. I'm just going to use a phi to abbreviate philosophy. Probably done that a couple of times this semester. And we started off by just looking at some basic general ideas of philosophy. That included just the basic idea of the love of wisdom. The examined life from Socrates. Blackburn's conceptual engineering. And then Kowalski's discerning and removing contradictions between non-empirical, universal, reasoned beliefs. Of course, there was a lot more in that opening lecture, but those were the kind of key things that I picked out with to help us organize our topics this semester, right? So we worried about conceptual clarity, right? Conceptual clarity, right, is important just for everyday practical stuff, right? Quiz is set up in a certain way, my syllabus and test is set up in a different way, right? So we need to use those words to mean those things, right? Just to be able to communicate clearly. So conceptual engineering, conceptual clarity, attempting to resolve contradictions among non-empirical universal reasoned beliefs from Klosowski, the love of wisdom, Socrates' examined life, right? And then we covered some basic topics in philosophy, logic and critical thinking. If you remember, I started off the semester with a bunch of panel slides of headlines about recent graduates from employers, and their complaint was that many recent graduates shut down when it comes to critical thinking and basic problem-solving skills. You may never worry about the mind-body problem again. I think that was weird if you never did at no time in your life. Or maybe worry about relativism and universal morality again in your life. But you will certainly have to engage in problem solving in your life and in your job. Well, what did we do in this class? We studied some heady philosophical issues and applied logic and critical thinking to them as best we could, right? So even if you never worry about whether, the morality of Game of Thrones again, you're going to have to argue with your boss and give reasons for things, for and against various things in your interpersonal relationships, your professional life, your social and political life. You're going to have to argue with health insurers and so forth. So those same skills of sorting out moral relativism arguments and figuring out whether they're contradictory or not are applicable to all of those sorts of things as well, right? And the difference being that those problems are typically easier to solve than a philosophical problem, right? So if you can go back and forth about what justice is according to Plato's Republic, you can certainly do a good job of doing a presentation and pitching something to your team at work to get everybody on board with it, right? So critical thinking and logic, and that stuff went through all of our other key topics, including epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and when it came to that subfield of philosophy, we studied a classical problem, the problem of skepticism. Remember, we have the evil demon argument, the dream argument, and then Descartes' cogito argument there. So again, some two basic arguments for skepticism and some criticisms against it, right? So arguments for and against. I'm not going to have room to do all of those, right? Then we did epistemic vices. We looked at two views about epistemic vices, motivationalism and obstructivism, which was by Kassam. We encountered him a few times this semester. I picked him for a particular reason. Then we looked at echo chambers, and epistemic bubbles, information bubbles. And then we looked at conspiracy theories. When is it reasonable, if ever, to believe a conspiracy theory? And what kinds of reasoning problems or flaws are often associated with conspiracy theories? Right? So we looked at Pigden and Shea there. So this was just when. And this was Pigden and Shea. Remember, he had the argument, everybody's a conspiracy theorist, but it depended on how he conceptualized conspiracy theory. Right? So again, look at our conceptual. In epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, Wynne was concerned with conceptual engineering as well, because he thought that we needed to distinguish these two concepts from one another. Right? After epistemology, we covered metaphysics. Particularly the mind-body problem. And there we looked at three basic views: substance dualism, reductive materialism, and then functionalism. And along with functionalism, we looked at the problem of AI consciousness. When I started studying philosophy, that sounded like philosophers doing science fiction. Does it sound like science fiction anymore? Not anymore. There's headlines all the time about whether these things are going to be sentient or not. Then we also looked at the simulation argument. So we had arguments for and against each of those positions, right? At least one, if not more. So those are the things to go back over. You will get asked questions about argument analysis and a passage that's expressing a philosophical view, and ask, well, what position is being expressed there, that kind of thing. Then we looked at moral philosophy. Here we looked at metaethics, and normative ethical theory. With metaethics, we looked at the debate between moral universalism versus moral relativism. We also looked at moral skepticisms, because there was both a practical and an epistemic one. So, right, that epistemic moral skepticism ought to remind you of epistemology. What are they denying? That there's any moral truths, right, as opposed to a reason to be moral. So there we had practical and epistemic. And again, arguments for and against. Here we had the tolerance argument and the cultural differences argument, and then criticisms of each of those. And again, the moral rationalism argument from Socrates versus the serial killer argument from the author. Then we looked at the persistent disagreement argument for epistemic moral skepticism and a criticism of that. And then when we got to normative ethics, we looked at deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and And then we also looked at alternatives to traditional normative ethics, and there we looked at care ethics and existentialist ethics. Gotta go all the way over here. Then we did political philosophy. When it came to political philosophy, we looked at a couple of different things as well. We looked at social contract theory. Particularly two versions of that, Hobbes and Locke, or really it was Locke and Rousseau, and the classical liberalism views. So again, Locke, Rousseau. Remember, we had the innocent strategy, the tick for tat strategy in that article. Look out for number one strategy. Then we looked at extremism. There we looked primarily at Kassam and Berger. They shared some similar features, but the reason why I emphasized Kassam is because Kassam's account of extremism as a political phenomenon, notice what he did, he started off again, conceptual clarity. Is this just a term of abuse, or does it pick out, is it just a silencing move? Similar thing to what Pigden did with regard to labeling something a conspiracy theory. Is it just a way of dismissing stuff, right, by labeling it a conspiracy theory or extremist, or does it pick out a real phenomenon? And Kassam said it was a real phenomenon. It has an ideological, a psychological, and a means component. And the ideological and psychological components of it, had a lot to do with his account of epistemic vices as well as his account of conspiracy theories. Remember, Kassam's definition of a conspiracy theory was basically that it's propaganda, right? So he kind of brings conspiracy theories, conspiracism, more precisely, epistemic vices, into his account of extremism. So he's got different, they're still related, right? He's still got like kind of a system that he's working on to fit all these different parts together for these different topics. It may seem unrelated, but again, he does a pretty good job of showing of how the psychological and epistemic and ideological elements of extremism dovetail with his account of obstructivism as an epistemic vice, or propaganda, conspiracy theories as propaganda. And so then the last thing we looked at was dehumanization. Dehumanization tied into both Kassam and Berger's account of extremism, both of which emphasize this idea of an us versus them, where where our survival, the in-group survival, is tied to the elimination or neutralization of the out-group, right? And of course, the key thing there was, the use of language and propaganda. So it's easy to see how dehumanization could function, how propaganda could dehumanize us by just employing some of the fallacies we learned that we ought to be avoiding, by employing them intentionally to manipulate people, like straw man fallacies, right? By defining the view in such a negative ways that no one would take it seriously, right? Just by straw manning a position, for example. So that's quite a bit of material. Again, we have either arguments or decision procedures and key ideas when it came to the normative ethics stuff, and then picking out and applying key ideas like Kassam's particular definition of extremism to pick out an example of that, or dehumanization, that particular idea. Again, not just about objectification or using offensive moral language or something like that, but dehumanizing by attributing a subhuman essence to them, not just denying them their humanity, but also attributing that subhuman essence to them, is a way of challenging things that were central to normative ethics, like moral standing. So moral standing and the issue of who is protected by and a party to the social contract, and who are we excluding from that contract, right? All kind of tie back in there. So again, we've got arguments, decision procedures, and key ideas to apply for pretty much each one of those views. Does anybody, what kinds of questions do y'all have about that material? You will get questions on fallacies, right? So I would go back, not just look at the old, wrap up with a couple of, I posted this on Moodle. It goes along with the last supplementary lesson that you could do on the value of philosophy. Again, it's a supplemental one. But Bertrand Russell was a famous 20th century philosopher. He wrote a number of books, including a history of philosophy book. And he included this little essay, The Value of Philosophy, as a part of that book. And I just pulled out two quotes about where he mentions what he believes the value of philosophy to be. And the podcast that's in the lesson, the supplemental lesson, is on the value of philosophy by a contemporary philosopher named Kitcher. Just had a book come out on it. And here's Russell, so a little background, as well as just two passages to kind of wrap this semester up with. Right, so philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty, and remember that we should probably be weary of certainty as a criteria for particular reasons, back from the epistemology lesson, what the true answer to the doubts which it raises, it is able to suggest many possibilities that enlarge our thoughts and free our thoughts from the tyranny of custom. Thus, while diminishing our feeling of certainty as to what things are, it gracefully increases our knowledge as to what they may be. It removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism, cut and paste didn't work very well, of those who have never traveled into the region liberating any doubt. And it keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar aspect in an unfamiliar aspect. So showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect. So that's the value of philosophy. It expands our understanding of the possibilities from our narrow, parochial, personal views, right? Remember, Socrates' idea of philosophy was the examined life, right? So that at least begins with looking at our own selves. Right? Then he says, another aspect to the value of philosophy, he says, apart from its utility in showing suspected possibilities, philosophy has value, perhaps its chief value, through the greatness of the objects which it contemplates, and the freedom from narrow and personal aims resulting from this contemplation. The life of the instinctive man, which he's contrasting with the life of the philosopher here. So again, kind of ending with a distinction that we started with from Professor Thunder in the first lecture, where he distinguished philosophical thinking from ideological thinking. Here it's the instinctive man and his parochial views. So the life of the instinctive man is shut up within the circle of his own private interests. Family and friends may be included, but the outer world is not regarded except as it may help or hinder what comes within the circle of his instinctive wishes. In such a life, there is something feverish and confined in comparison with the philosophical life is calm and free, right? So if you remember, way back at the beginning of the semester, I pointed to the LSU mission statement of expanding our knowledge, conserving and disseminating knowledge, so again, epistemic vices, and its relationship to philosophy by liberating us from, unthinking prejudices, right? Even if they're not malicious prejudices. All right, so there's just a little wrap-up of the semester. Again, that last little supplementary lesson is available on